So I should have enough space. I'm still not sure why it looked like I ran out of space. Because it looks like, at least, I mean, I deleted some stuff, but I have like 500 gigs. I don't think I had 500 gigs, so I just deleted. So I don't know what happened. But so we kind of talked through yeah. So we kind of talked about the HTML and the CSS stuff. Is that kind of coming back from everybody? It's been a while since we've touched on the front end things. But hopefully things are kind of jiving again with where we were. So that's kind of the setup to where we come into React. Because we still need to understand HTML, we still need to understand CSS. That doesn't go away just because we add another piece in there. Just from backstory, I mean, I think we decided back in, 2019 to add Node and React to the curriculum, I think. So this has kind of been 2 years in the making in some sense or shape. This is the first time we're teaching React. So that's part of why, Evan's sitting in here so we can kind of figure this thing out. So this is not something we've taught before. I've had about 2 years to kind of play around with it and try to learn some things, but it's actually not my area of expertise per se. So I'm still learning along with you guys. So I know a little bit because I've played around with it a little bit, but it's still something that I'm still learning and still getting better at. Just to give you some background on what React is and where it came from and all of that before I get into the code per se, it's a technology that was created at Facebook in 2011. So history-wise, that's a good kind of marker to make. So Facebook, 2011. So it first hit their news feed in 2011. It's been there now for 10 years. It's been a tool that they've used. Anytime you're using Facebook, if you're on their main news feed, you're seeing React. That's how they make that work. Over the earlier kind of development of that, Facebook kind of figured out that is something that everybody could use. So it became open source around 2013 is what the research I was able to find. So it's been publicly available. Other websites have been able to use it for like 8 years now. Okay. So in that sense, it's pretty mature, right? It's pretty widely used. Everybody good with that? So it's seen a lot of development. They actually created it as a replacement for jQuery, sort of thing, is another part of the history. So back then, when around this time, 2011, that was the main tool. Like it was jQuery or, well, then React. So they made it as kind of an alternative. So they created it, the guy who created it came up with it as a way to solve some of the problems with, or some of the issues with jQuery that started cropping up as they got these more complex UIs. Like you think about what's on the Facebook feed, there's a lot of things going on there. There's a lot of different widgets and a lot of different components and a lot of different functionality that's going into that, just that one page. And it became, as time went on, really kind of impractical to do that with jQuery. Part of that is just because the page became more and more complex. And the other part of that is just they have a huge number of developers, right? So a huge number of developers putting code into that main page became an issue. Okay, and so that's where React really shines, is where you're trying to do a lot of dynamic stuff, especially when you're trying to do a lot of dynamic stuff in a single page. If you have a relatively static page, all you want to do is a little bit of form validation, it's going to look a little bit cumbersome. Okay. So that's part of why we're going to use it with the bug tracker project, because we're going to have enough going on that it starts to make sense. Okay, cool. So we're going to put in sort of CRUD operations with that. Obviously, you can still use jQuery to build anything that you can do with React. It just may be easier to do it with React. Is kind of the trade-off. Okay. Another thing, just point of history. There was a big shift in React, and we got something called hooks in 2018 is the date I have. 2018. So this is pretty much new off the books. Like this has only been out there for about 3 years, but it's really made a big shift to how we develop React applications today. Okay, so that's a big deal, and this is where we're going to be really focusing as we build things out with React. Okay, so what else do I have in my minutes? Okay, so part of React, what this hooks shift has done, historically when we built React apps, we've typically done that with classes. So we said with React, you kind of break things down into things called components. They're kind of like your custom widgets that you're making. So you make your UI out of these custom widgets, these custom components. Previously, we defined these classes, defined those components using a class, using a class in JavaScript. With hooks, we've transitioned to using functions, right? So I'll kind of show you briefly how you can do it with classes, but we're going to do most of this with functions instead of classes, okay? So we're going to prefer to do that way. In fact, when you create a new project now, using their generator, you get function components instead of class components. So that's one side of things. So I kind of mentioned, right, that React is kind of an alternative to jQuery, right? Or jQuery, remember, was an alternative to just doing vanilla JavaScript, accessing the DOM directly. Does anybody remember what DOM stands for? Document Object Model. You had a hand up? Okay, so that's what it is, right? So remember, the DOM is like a model in the memory and in kind of the runtime that you can see. I want to modify the HTML elements and the CSS that's around them. So when we're using either the DOM, vanilla JavaScript methods, or we're using jQuery, we're manipulating the actual content of the page, okay? The way that React works, it kind of divorces you from that DOM directly, and so you kind of modify the DOM indirectly, okay, which we'll kind of see, okay. So it's part of that is that indirection is where it's different, okay. So when I'm working with things in jQuery or manipulating the DOM, what you learned in first semester was kind of how to do things, as we would say, imperatively. You say, if this happens, if the user clicks this button or submits this form or focuses this field or whatever, then do this. Then make this change to the page. So you'd imperatively write down to say, here is the changes I want to make with the page when the user does this action. Okay. So React is different. It does things what we would say declaratively. Okay. So jQuery is imperative. React is declarative. So what you, instead of saying, this is how I'm going to change the page or change the way the view, the UI looks, is what I say is, I'm going to change the data, and the data is going to regenerate the page. Okay? So I declare how the page should look given certain data, and so I just change the data, and the data causes the page to be regenerated. Does that kind of make sense? It's a different way of thinking of it. It's a way of thinking of kind of the data as, you might say, the source of truth that turns up and becomes the page, rather than the page being the source of truth, right? Or oftentimes what would happen is you would have data in the background and the view, and you'd have to try and keep those two things in sync with jQuery. It automatically keeps those things in sync for you. And so that's where the main benefit is it switches you over to a declarative method of thinking, which means inherently to use React, you have to kind of think about the problems differently.
Would you say data-driven web development? Is that a good kind of way to think of it?
Maybe.
Data-driven web development? I mean,
it is kind of that the data drives it.
Yeah.
Right? It's just the word declarative means that you say, this is how I would declare that the UI should look, rather than how do I get from here to here. Like, rather than saying that this field becomes red now, I just say, hey, there's an error. And I have code over here that says, if there's an error, then make it red, right? Rather than saying, this is problematic, so change the display the error message. So I don't say display the error message, I just update the data to save the fact that there is an error message, and maybe the text of the error message. Does that kind of make sense? So we'll see it as kind of a backwards way of thinking. But it's really, really helpful as things scale, because what happens is, especially as your page, as your problem gets more complicated and you have more hands on it, you add more features, and those features start to have overlaps where you say, okay, well, this feature needs to display some data here, or this needs to happen every time you do blah, blah, blah. Those overlaps tend to be an issue where it's like, okay, well, this developer did this and fixed it and made this work, but it only worked with the code that they knew about at the time. Whereas this other developer is working on a new feature, and now you have code that you need that kind of puts those two features together, that makes them work together. So building declarative UI tends to kind of put that in there, if that makes sense. If it's driven from the UI, you tend to have kind of less issues where this feature broke that feature. You can kind of plan for it, more or less. Okay? You don't have to plan for all the things that, like, I change this, I hit this button, that needs to make all these things happen. You just say, okay, I changed the data, and later we'll say, okay, we'll change how the UI displays based on where the data's at. So those are things to keep in mind. Overall, this, we would say, the way I would kind of explain that is it reduces something called the kind of cyclomatic complexity, how things scale, right? So if we think about adding features, I add a feature here, and I add a feature here, and I add a feature here, it kind of, the complexity in the special cases tends to grow exponentially if you're using jQuery, right? So I might have two different things that could happen here, two different things that could happen here, two different things that happen here, and now I've got 8 different cases that I have to deal with in my code for when you click a button, right? Whereas if I can do things declaratively, this is 2, it's just A or B, this is A or B, this is A or B. So it kind of goes linearly instead of exponentially in complexity. Okay, that's kind of where the difference lies. So overall, that tends to result in a lot fewer bugs, just that change alone. Okay, so a few things to know from the paradigm and the way that we write things in React. Okay, so React uses something called components. Components are the basic building blocks. You can think of them as widgets or your own kind of custom controls. And so the components are pieces that you can put together like Lego bricks and kind of build a page out of those components. Components can also contain other components. So for instance, I could say, let's have a list of bugs, and then I'll have a bug component for each of those. So I might have a bug list component, and the bug, I might have a search, some sort of search form that might be part of the bug list. And so then, you search and that updates the bug list. So you can put all these components together. You can basically kind of look at your UI, draw some boxes around it, and say, oh, this is a part that I can reuse, and move that around, right? So we're going to break that down into components. That's one part of React. Those components are going to have basically what's called a render method. That render method is where we declare, say, if it's the state, then go render the HTML that you want to show for that component at this particular time. That rendered HTML generates what we call a shadow DOM. So the component renders a shadow DOM. Okay, so that's not the real DOM. It's not the actual DOM that the browser uses. It's kind of a fake copy The good news is that shadow DOM is very cheap. It's very cheap to generate, but we generate it every time we want to render. So we throw it away, start over. Okay. What React then does is anytime a change to the state occurs, it re-renders those components that need to be re-rendered, takes those shadow DOM, compares it with the real DOM, and will actually update the parts that need to be changed. So kind of with jQuery, what we had to do oftentimes, and we did this over the summer, is if you had to make a change, you kind of throw all the DOM away and put a brand new thing in there, right? But React just changes the parts that have changed. Not everything, just replaces the little parts that have changed. Which actually kind of works really good with things like CSS animations, because it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to animate the things that have changed. Cool. It's kind of a weird thing. The good news is you usually don't have to do too much with like knowing that there's a shadow DOM versus a real DOM. It just kind of happens in the background. You just say, here's the thing I want, and it automatically turns it into the thing you want. Okay? But it is something that we have to kind of keep in mind. So when it does that comparison, we say it, oftentimes you'll hear the term diff. There's a difference. It computes the difference between the shadow and the real, and that's how it determines what to change, what to update. React also uses a weird language called JSX, which is a combination of JavaScript and XML. Okay, so it's not pure HTML, it's not pure XML, it's not pure JavaScript. It's this weird mashup of those two. And sometimes that means there's certain things where we're going to see stuff in a JSX file that looks like kind of like HTML, and other places that kind of looks like JavaScript, and we're going to kind of blend those two together. It also means that there's some cases where we have to use different names. So for instance, when we're dealing with JSX, we can't necessarily use all the same names that we used in HTML. So for instance, in HTML, we use the word class, right, to say these elements should kind of have all the same CSS styles. Got it? Aaron, you heard that? Versus when we're doing things in JSX, the name there ends up, we have to call it class name in JSX with React because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. So there's some cases where they had to change the name because that word was already reserved in JavaScript and wasn't available for them to use as an attribute. Cool? So some of the attribute names are slightly different with the JSX. With that JSX syntax, it actually does mean that your React code can't run directly on the browser. Okay? So the code word that we're going to write from the browser, we can't just say, okay, browser, run this JSX code. It would say, I don't know how to do that. I know how to run JavaScript. I know how to deal with XML, but I don't know how to deal with JSX. So what we do is we take the code that we write, we run it through something called a transpiler, and that turns it into JavaScript that the browser can actually use. So what the browser ends up getting is that transpiled JavaScript, but what we're writing is JSX. So what we're writing and what the browser's running are not the same thing. Everybody good with that? There are some benefits to that. Namely, because it's already being transpiled, we can use all of the modern JavaScript features and not worry if the browser supports it. So I can use const and let and async await, and even if the browser doesn't necessarily support those things, when it gets transpiled, those things will be transpiled out. So it actually can run on older browsers that don't necessarily support some of the newer JavaScript features that we're using. Cool? That's huge, right? That's kind of a thing that's lost in there. But that is actually a big benefit for doing the transpiling anyway. Another gotcha is that so far we've been using Node, right? How did we bring in modules up at the top? Required, okay. So historically, Node has used a syntax for modules called CommonJS. So in Node, we have CommonJS modules, okay. The way that we built those modules are two parts. So the top looks like this. So let's say I want to bring in express. Const express is equal to require express. Okay. And then when we want to export things, we said module dot exports. And let's say I wanted to export like that off middleware, then that would like that, right? So we have require to bring things in, and module.exports with assignment to send things out. Okay? So this is how you do things with common JS modules. Common JS modules, which historically is the only way that Node used to support things. Node actually does support the newer one that we're going to use with React. The newer thing is called ES modules, also known as like ECMA scripts modules. So these are the standard way it's kind of coming to do modules in JavaScript. The gotcha with this, in order to turn these on for, there's a few gotchas with using these with Node. Node, you can either, there's a setting in package.js, you can switch over and we'll do it this way. Or you can change the extension to your files to, I think, like JSM. If it's a JSM file, it'll read it this way instead of reading it as this. So there is a way to do this. The other gotcha is that it doesn't exactly work the same as required. So there are some cases, especially actually .end is kind of weird to set up with ESM. Okay, so that's part of why I didn't switch us over here yet, because most modules haven't kind of told you how to do this yet in the documentation wise. Okay, so here's what it looks like in ESM. Over here, we're going to do import express from express. This is kind of functionally the same thing. There's also one difference in that these have to be at the top of the file, whereas require you can technically put it anywhere in the file. Okay? Good with that? So import thing from thing. If we want to export something, say I want to export something like this, that would be export, I think is it exports or export? Is it plural or singular? Where's my mouse? So export, yeah. So export default off. Okay. So the way that export looks is a little bit different than the way the export looks over here. Good with that? So this is kind of the new way to do things, and this is kind of the old way of doing things. So we've done this on our back end, but we're going to be doing this in our front end code in JavaScript. So you kind of have to keep that straight. Some of the modules that you read up on will write out and give the instructions on NPM this way. Some on NPM will give the instructions this way. Okay? So you just have to kind of know how to translate. Okay? Also worth mentioning, sometimes you'll want to do some destructuring, namely to pull other things out. So for instance, with React, other things, let's say we have our database. You remember that one of the things we did was pull out individual methods. So I could have pulled out DB module is the whole thing, or I can destructure, pull out piece by piece, and I can say like new ID, find pet, etc. Right, and that would be that require so that would be the syntax, how we would pull out just like two functions that we've exported. The way that we do the same thing with ES modules is you say import that would be the same thing. So it should look very, very similar, right? It's just the difference here, we have this kind of const keyword versus here we have import, the things we want to bring in from block. Okay? So those are some of the syntactic differences that you're going to see when we get into the world of React. Good? That's what's going on. We kind of talked about we're going to be using hooks, which historically, again, things were usually, the components were usually built as classes. We're going to be building them as functions. And so that's going to shift things. All right. So I want to get in. I want to look at how to create a new React project. Okay. There are a bunch of different ways that you can create a new React project. You may have already heard me say that we're going to keep our back end as one project and we're going to do our front end as a new project. So when we create that new front end project, first things first, we need to create a repository. And then inside of that repository, once we pulled it down, we're going to run a special command. So we're going to say, inside that, we're going to run npx create React app, and then you can specify a path. Okay? So npx is the node package runner. It will actually go ahead and download a package from the npm registry and run it directly. So we use that today with a lot of global sort of installs. Historically, you remember we can kind of do npm install -g. That will install things globally and then run things. So this tool in particular, Create React App, tends to get a lot of updates, and you always pretty much want to get the latest version. So this actually makes sure that you're always on the latest version. If you do an npm install and then run this, you'll find that usually you're running an old version of Create React App. So doing it this way makes sure that you're always running the newest one. Good with that? Michael, did you get that? Okay. So that's what we want to do, is we want to say npx create React App. Okay. So if you look on npm, you'll see that there's a package named Create React App. This is one way to generate a project. There actually are a bunch of different ways. There's a bunch of different tools that you can use to set up a new project. In fact, there's some different templates that you can start with, and we'll give you a different starting point. We're going to just start with the basic template. This tool is really good from a learning perspective. It's really the best way and the quickest way to get up and running with a brand new project. It's not necessarily the best tool if you want to do production and do all the things that really come into an actual application. So there are other tools change that you can get set up, but they require a little bit more work. In fact, we could probably spend a week or two just talking about how to do that. So we're going to do it this way, the easy way, so you guys can just get familiar with React and focus less on how do we do the transpiling and how do we do the building. Cool. Okay. So specifically when we do this, I'm going to set, so the path says where do you want to create that project. When I run this, I'm going to put a dot at the end to say that I want to run it in my current directory once I get this up and running. Okay. Let's get coding. So that's the kind of that's where we kind of got some tools to get started. I am going to close actually what I have open here. So what we're going to try and build today, with the time we've got left, and we'll finish this up tomorrow if we didn't finish this today. What we're going to be building today is the shopping cart. Everybody see that on my screen? So we're going to be building this shopping cart. So you can kind of see it says shopping cart at the top. It says how many things are in the shopping cart. So there's 5 things in the shopping cart. I've gotten a button to add more things to the shopping cart. I've got 3 different things in the shopping cart. So I've got hat and tie and belt. 2 of these, 1 of these. I can add or remove things. Hit the plus, increase the quantity or decrease the quantity. So this is what we're going to be building today, and hopefully we'll try to get as far as we can with this. Okay? So everybody got kind of that in their picture? Let me go ahead and throw a copy of this screenshot out there on a Discord if anybody wants to keep that open. So let's see. Desktop. I think I had this on my desktop. So there's the thing we're going to be building today. That's our plan. Okay. So I tossed the mock-up in Discord so you can have it there if you need it, if you want to follow along as we're doing this. I'm going to go out to GitHub and log into my GitHub account, and I'm going to create a new repository. So I'm going to start. So I'm going to go there. I want to go repositories. Oh, I want to hit plus, create a new repository. So that new repository is going to be React shopping cart. So you can create that project. Follow along with this, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely follow along with this. So I'm going to create React shopping cart. I'm going to mark this, mark it as a private project. We're going to add a README, a get ignore, and a license. The get ignore will be node. The license will be MIT. Okay. It's worth noting that React kind of is going to be running on top of Node, so that's why I'm kind of using the same ignore file as Node. Okay, so those are things we want to set up. I'm going to go ahead and hit create repository. All right. So once you get that done, you want to clone this down to your system. Clone that repository down to your system. So I'm going to go in here, hit the drop down, copy, go to my projects folder. So I'm going to go into Node here and clone it down here. So git clone, React shopping cart. Okay, and I'm going to right click this and open it with VS Code. So it should be here with just a get ignore, a license, and a read. That's all that's in there. It's kind of the same place we started for a new project. So instead of building the back end, we're building the front end. So I'm going to pull up the terminal. What we're going to put into that terminal is that command, npx create react app space dot. That's what we're going to put in there. There we go. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's right. I saw that this morning too. So when you run that, you may get a question asking if you want to install Create React app. If you see that, just hit enter. That will say yes, and keep going. Because you haven't previously installed that.
Is it installing it locally or is it installing it to package it JSON?
So it's doing a few things. So when you run this as npx, it's going to install globally in some place on your system. It actually doesn't install the same place when you do the mobile install. But when it creates the project will also have a dependency on some of the create app stuff. Okay, so it's going to have some dependencies that are related to this create app. Yes. Yeah, there's a lot built in there. There's a lot built in there. Part of why we didn't want to just start on how we build all that stuff up ourselves. We need to save it for every day before we start. And I do it with Webpack and Babel and how to set those things up. And we do that before we do it. This is the other reason why we're not building it into the same document.
I think it says happy happy. It says what? It says happy happy.
So, what are you recording it all? Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying.
No,
Oh yeah, I think I looked that up one time. I mean, really, you should look it up. It's related to something particular. I think happy hacking is a reference, isn't it?
Oh, maybe?
I think I was looking at something. There's a keyboard layout called HHKD, happy hacking keyboard. It's where they remove the windows and the full app.
Yeah, just a reminder that that dot is important at the end is important because that's it.
it's like that keyboard like the first 60% keyboard.
I don't know. Oh, it was originally produced in Japan.
Keep it there. Okay, so then this is there. Awesome. Oh, apparently the word hack this will mean the further problem solving. So then that instance is not
It's only breaking errors we get a lot of.
Oh, although you get called burglary tools.
Yeah, that's it. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Like at the scene or in your car?
You have all the tools. The burglary.
Dang. Guess I gotta go clean on my car then.
Huh? No, it's good. Yeah. So we're going to walk through this now, and we know we're going to actually watch my screen for a moment, so we can kind of explore what's here. So if we look at what's in the package now, you're going to see that now that we've done that create React app, there's a bunch of additional files in our project, right? And so what it's done is set up a basic React application. If you look at the console, you're going to see that it gives you some information, like, hey, it created it in that project, that folder that we're in. You can see that there's an npm start command. That's how we're going to actually start the server. There's an npm run build, which is how you generate, it's going to build up the production version. Good news is that when we deploy this for Heroku, Heroku will automatically run that build script. So we'll actually build it and then use the production build of it. So this is great. There's also a test. If you wanted to run unit tests against your UI, that's already set up. And you'll notice that there's an npm run inject. Okay. If you run this, this will throw away kind of the nice shell that this is set up to make it easier to work with and get you back to the end original tool. So if you want to see what's actually happening under the covers and start to set up your own tool chain. Okay. We don't want to run this. If you run that, you're going to have to discard your changes and backtrack to before you did it. You don't want to run that. We might do that for investigation purposes, but definitely don't run that command on your bug tracker. Because we want to stay in the nice safe zone of what we have. Okay. Looking at the files that we have, you'll notice that now there's some very familiar files here. There's a package.json and there's a package.lock.json. So in the package.json, you can see that there's the name of the project. Version is 0.1.0. It's marked as private. Private meaning that it won't allow this to be uploaded to the NPM registry, which is actually a good thing. You can see that's already added a number of dependencies. So it's adding 3 for testing library. That's if you want to run unit tests. It's added a dependency based on React and React DOM. React and React DOM are the two you always need if you're doing anything with React. Those are the base part of React. There's also dependency on React scripts. React scripts is actually part of this whole create React container, this generator that we just created. That's what does actually all the magic. All the magic is in this React scripts dependency. So if you want to update to a newer version of Create React App, literally all you have to do is update that one dependency. And now you're on a newer version of Create React App. It's awesome. Okay. Web Vitals is a newer thing that's in there, which is kind of for performance monitoring. And that's new enough that I haven't really played around with it to see what it's there for. You'll notice that we have some scripts, similar kind of scripts we started before. Remember we started at like a start and a start down. So you can see they've got a start, a build, a test, and inject script. That's what we just saw on the command line as it's telling us about those commands. You'll also notice that there's some configuration for ESLint. It's telling ESLint that, hey, we have something that's based on React, and we're using Jest to test it, so use that as your base for how you suggest we write our code, how you do your linting. There's also a browser list that says, when I do the transpilation, what versions of the browsers do I want to support? So it's saying, okay, for production, I want to support any browser that's got at least 0.2% of the market share and is not dead, as in there's not any more updates happening to it, and it's not Opera Mini. So we're saying, hey, we're not supporting Opera Mini, and we're not supporting browsers that are dead. We're just going to support popular browsers.
Yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting one. And then if we're in development, we're going to compile it with a different compatibility. So we're actually, for development, doing it much more narrowing and only the one latest version. So we're supporting more browsers in production and fewer browsers in development, mainly just so things run faster. But these things you can freely change if you decide you want to test against more browsers. Cool. So that stuff's set up. It's really, all of this is the same as Node. The only difference is that there's some magic happening with React scripts, and you can kind of see them referred to in the scripts here. Okay, so there's some magic runner happening there. You may also see that you now have a README-MD and a README-MD old. So this old one is the one that we got when we just created the project, and that's been replaced by these instructions. So it generated a README if you ever need to go back and see, like, what are those things that just said on the console, what are those commands and what do they do? So you can go back to refer to those instructions. Cool? That's what that's about. All right, so let's look at the actual code. There's two folders in here. There's a public folder and there's a source folder. Okay, so the public folder is kind of like what we saw before. They're resources that are just directly being shipped to the browser. Nothing's happening magic with those. They're just being shipped to the browser almost verbatim. The source is where all the magic React type of stuff is. Now, there is one file that we want to look at over in the public folder first, and that's where we're going to start diving into this React application. Okay. So in public, you'll see that there's a folder called index.html. This is actually where your code starts. Okay. So when the server starts up, it's going to run this file first. Everybody good with that? Okay. Now, before I dive into that too much, Dawn, is yours finished running? Okay. So in your terminal, we're going to run another command. If you don't have your terminal still pulled up, pull it up again. We're going to run npm start. That's going to start the server up. It'll take a minute. And it should actually open it directly in the kernel. Okay? So once it's starting up, you should see something like this. Okay. So out of the box, Create React App is giving us the code for this just tiny app with a spinning logo. All good with that? There's really not too much here, but there's a little bit of an example just so you can kind of see how these things are structured. Dawn, did you get that up and running? Okay, good. Michael, you're all good? Okay. So, back to here. So let's look at what's actually going on. So, index.html, we can see that there's a head, there's some stuff in here. You can see that there's something interesting going on with the favicon, public URL favicon. So this percent in here, percent public URL, is getting kind of replaced with where public URL ends up. Okay, so that's going to be replaced kind of on build time. So if we were to look at the source in the browser, and go over to the browser and say view source, view page source, you would see here, well, it looks like it just got replaced with a slash. So where it put public was just at the root. It's kind of how we set up our new project. Okay. So those things got replaced. Notice in here, do you see the spinning logo, the code for the spinning logo anyway? Notice in that HTML, We also don't have this text, edit source app JSON. So most of the content on this page is not in the HTML. Okay? This is all that's actually in the HTML, this tiny little shell. Okay? So most of the code, most of the stuff that actually makes up this page is in this script down here. You see static.js, bundle.js at the bottom? So what it's doing is it's bundling and transpiling, taking the components and taking all the stuff we're going to build in the app, turning it into this bundle and serving that bundle up to the browser. Okay? And so as we make changes in Visual Studio Code, it will be regenerating this bundle. Is everybody good with that? Okay. So things to see, right? Notice that like there is a title, but it's just kind of up here React app. Okay. Notice that there is, where's our style sheet? Do we have a style sheet in there? Where's our CSS? Is there a link tag in here? No link to our CSS. Okay. So also in this bundle is included the CSS for this page. So not only the JavaScript, there's like HTML, there's a mix of HTML and CSS and JavaScript that is all being turned into this bundle.js. So everybody good with that? Okay. So the only thing that actually exists in this page, body, there's a div with the ID of root. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this code of HTML. Okay. So there's a comment here that says, hey, this is a template. This is an empty file. What we're going to be doing basically when we start up the React application is we take generally an element in the page. So here they're taking this element called root. We grab it and then we stuff a component into it. So it's actually going to be turning this root component in the index.html into our application. So our entire application is going to go into that one div. Okay? It's all going to go into that one div. All right. So this is really the only thing that really matters in the index.html is that one tag. Okay? Is the root tag. So let's look into source. Let's go into index.js under source. Okay, so index.js, this is kind of where our bundle starts. Okay, this is the entry point, as you might say, which is kind of like our server.js, right? It's kind of the first thing that runs. So when we look at index.js, you can see some imports at the top. So it's importing like React DOM, and these are ESM imports. You can see it's importing index.css. So that's where it's actually bringing in the index.css style sheet. So everything in there is becoming part of the bundle. It's also bringing in a component called app, which we'll look at in a second. Okay? And it's bringing in this report vitals thing. So there's some imports at the top. Here's where React starts. So we say react.dom.render. Okay? So this function takes two arguments. It takes what do you want to render and where do you want to render. So we're telling it to render document.element by root. So remember when we looked at HTML, there was a div with the ID of root. So we're getting that div right here and replacing it with this. Okay. That React strict mode is a relatively new thing. It actually wasn't there when I was learning this last. But what it does is it just gives you some information about mistakes that you're making or bad behavior. So that helps with debugging. That's the only reason the strict mode is there. App then is where our main component is. So this application component, that's really our entire application, right? And actually, that's where we're going to stuff most of the code maybe to begin with. Okay? So everybody good with that? So there's a bunch of stuff, there's a bunch of files in here that kind of set up the project, but most of the actual logic is all the way down here. Okay? Most of the actual logic we need is down and out. So let's go dig down to the app component. So you should see that there's index. This is the entry point. That's the conventional that actually has to be named index for create React app. You'll see some files in here. So app, you'll notice, starts with an uppercase A. The convention is all of your components start with an uppercase letter. So if you're making a new component, you're going to start that name of the file with that. Inside of the app component, you can see another import. So it's actually bringing in like an SVG file via an import. It's also bringing in some CSS files. So it's bringing in app CSS. We'll look at the CSS in a minute. And here is actually our component. So if I look at the general structure, app is a function. Okay, so app defines a function. That's our component. Okay. Anytime we want to make a new component, we make a new file. It's going to have an app like this. And then you can see at the end, it exports that. So we create a function, name it, export it. Yeah. It does look a lot like a middleware. Yeah, it's kind of that same structure. Yep. It's very, very, very similar to how we built out a middleware. Okay, so here's where the action happens. So in terms of the app, the most important to do thing to do in a component is you return what the component should look like. Okay? What's the content that you want the component to render? What the HTML is. So you can see it's rendering on the outer side, it's got a div. That div has a class name of app. And you'll notice the interesting name as I was mentioning. So rather than calling it class, we have to call it class name. There's a header field, there's a header tag, class name, app header. Now here's where things start getting interesting. Image, source, curly brace logo, right? So actually putting a variable kind of in the middle of the HTML. So they're taking that logo that we loaded up at the top and putting it here as the source. So logo is a variable. I'm not hard coding like the path to the logo. This is actually the logo, the image itself is being put in the middle. I've got class name, I've got logo. So you can kind of see image tag, paragraph, anchor tag, header. So in a lot of ways, this looks like regular HTML that's just being returned from a function. Now, one thing that might strike you as odd, maybe or not, notice that this whole thing is not quoted. It's literally just in the HTML. It's literally just in the HTML. That's the JSX part. That's the JSX part right there. The rest around this is all still JavaScript. This stuff in the middle is not. This is that mix of XML and JavaScript. Okay. And so basically we put this in curly braces to kind of say, hey, or parentheses to kind of say, hey, we're going to kind of switch languages here. And so we do that. And anytime you want to switch back to JavaScript, that's where you're going to see curly braces. So if you see a pair of curly braces, that means it's switching back from XML back into JavaScript code. Okay? Otherwise, it would just be literally the string logo. Okay. So, one thing I might remark, and I want to show you real quick, this is the new way to do things. So I said we're doing React hooks. This is what's called a function component. The way we used to do these things, in fact, if you look at the React tutorial, it still says the old way on their website. The way that we used to do things is we would write a class. So this is the shopping list component. It's a class. It extends React.component. So this is a subclass of React.component. Okay. So this used to be how we would write these components. Inside of there, you would then have to write a render method. And the render method would be where this stuff is. There's a bunch of other methods you could add, and oftentimes you would have a constructor and things like this. But this kind of turned out to be more verbose than we needed for a lot of cases. And it also actually just kind of turned out to be complicated, especially because we had to deal with the this keyword and all the weirdness that comes with that, and inheritance and all those kind of things. So we kind of shifted from this format. If you see any, if you're looking at the tutorial, or if you're looking at if you're looking at the tutorial where you're looking at stuff online, you may see this old way of doing things. That's what we're turning it into. So basically what's inside of the render is the whole component. Okay? Is everybody good with that? So that's kind of as much as I want to say about that. I'm going to shift it over. All right. Let's take a quick look and see what they did with the CSS. Yep.
You have a function called app.
Yes.
Is that app your component?
Yes.
So you can make five functions. They all have different names, and that would represent 5 components.
Yep. Yep. Effectively, yes. Effectively, yes.
And then what a component needs to do is it needs to return some JSX.
Yeah. Basically, yeah. It needs to return some JSX. We'll do some additional things in there, namely using things like hooks, which this doesn't include any hooks. It's just a function. And that will make it a little bit more interesting and make it turn it into kind of an actual component, and rather than just a function. So that's our starting point. Looking briefly at the CSS, you'll notice that there's an index.css and there's also an app CSS. So the index CSS is typically where we put code or CSS that's just application wide. So anything that you want to say, this applies to the entire application, you're going to put that in index.css. If it's CSS that just applies to one component, so for instance, they're saying, here's some code that just applies to the app component, we're putting this in app CSS. So we've got like app.app, app logo, app header, and you'll notice that those all correspond to classes that they've defined here. So app header, app logo, app link, etc. So that's oftentimes how we do some of that styling. Everybody good with that? Okay. So where we're going, remind you, we're going to build the shopping cart. That's what we're trying to do today. We're trying to work on this. Okay. So I'm going to get rid of some stuff and clear off some of the crud so we can kind of start from a clean slate so we can get to this. All good? So I'm going to delete some things first. So going into index.css. So I'm going to go into index.css. I'm going to just start with a clean slate there. Nothing in index.css. Same way with app CSS, I'm just going to completely delete app CSS. So I've got an index CSS. I've still got my index.js as it was. I'm going to go into app.js. Actually, I'm going to get rid of this test too, because I don't need it related to what I'm doing. So I have just an app.js. Okay. Also, to kind of simplify things down, I'm going to get rid of the reference to the logo. I will get rid of the reference to the CSS file, so I just have a function. Okay. Inside of that function, I'm just going to return a simple div. Hello world. Okay. So I'm going to save this now, and what you should have in the browser is just this. It's just the text hello world, nothing else. So you're starting with a very bare bones basic setup. Sometimes you may want to go inspect. If you were to go to view page source, you wouldn't see what's going on. But if I do go to inspect, you can see that there's my div hello world, right? Everybody good with that? Cool? Okay. So thinking about where I'm going, okay, usually what I start doing is I start thinking about what are the components that I kind of need to build this together, right? So how can I break this down into pieces, okay? So thinking about this, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to start by saying this right here, that is a cart item, okay? So these individual items, these rows, I'm going to call a cart item. The whole thing I'm going to call cart list. So I'm going to be making a cart item component and a cart list component. Okay? I'm going to actually start on the inside and work my way out, which might seem weird, but it will make more sense when you get there. So I'm going to start by creating a cart item, which is going to represent that one row. Okay? So we're going to make a new component. The way we're going to make that new component, I'm going to right click on source. I'm going to say new file. I'm going to name this file cart item.js. And you'll note the capitalization. So I'm doing Pascal casing. Cart is uppercase and I is uppercase. Okay. Your components, we kind of look at our function component. What all is in there? It's just a function, and then we export it. So that's really all the code I'm going to start with. I'm going to say let's declare a function called cart item. And we're going to say export default cart item. So inside of here, I want to build up the HTML that I need for each of those cart items. Okay? So if I kind of think about, okay, well, what do I need? Well, I probably need a container that contains the whole thing, right? I need a block that I can put everything into, right? I need that whole block, okay? So let's start with that as a div, okay? So I'm going to say on the outer level, there's a div here, okay? And I'm going to kind of work my way left to right with the components that go into there. So if I think about what's there, I have an input field to type in the name of the product. I've got a space to type in, put in the quantity, and I've got an add and a remove button. Okay? So I'm going to end up with 4 tags, 4 elements within here. Everybody good with that? Okay. So let's start laying that out. So I've got an input element. And it's worth noting, you kind of see if I close that input, you'll see it immediately will try to add a closing tag. Well, because XML, all tags have to be closed. Okay. So if you don't specify, if normally, everything needs an end tag. I want this to be an empty element. So one thing you have to remember with empty elements in XML, you do have to end them with a slash. Okay. You do have to end them with a slash to say that this is empty. It doesn't have any content. Okay, so we have an input. I'm going to put a span in for the quantity. I've got a button for adding, and I've got another button for removing. Okay. All right, let's fill in some of the content. Okay, so I know that the quantity is probably going to start at 0. So let's say we do that. Or maybe I start the quantity at, I'll leave it at 0. So the quantity is 0. The button has the text add, the first button. The second button is remove. I do eventually want these to show up as plus and minus buttons. But I'm putting add and remove in there for accessibility reasons because I do want the screen reader to read it as add and remove instead of reading it as plus and minus. Okay? So we're going to get rid of that text eventually, but I want to start with that. Okay? In terms of the input, I might want to put in a value there, and that would be like product, or maybe it'd be hat. Okay, so I say hat, add, remove. Okay, so far I haven't introduced any variables, right? So those are always going to be hat, 0, add, remove. Cool. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like so far. I'm going to go back to the application component, right? And what I want to do is I want to render the component that we just created on this page. Okay? So in order to render another component, you have to import it first. So import cart item from cart item. And did I remember? Okay. Oh, yep. So I do have to do /cart item because it's in the current directory. /cart item. Okay. So now I have that cart item component accessible to me in that code. And I'm going to say, let's replace this text of hello world. I'm going to put in a cart item. Actually, let's make that an empty tag. So I'm going to close it right there. And I'm actually going to duplicate that twice. So we have 3 cart items that should appear when I look at the page. So if I go back and look, there are 3 cart items there. Okay. So far, so good. Nothing terribly interesting, but you're starting to see I can make my own components, right? And then use them in other components. So I've got cart items that are nested inside of the application component. Okay. I might also, while I'm in here, I might want to add a header. So I might add a quick H1 up here and say this is my shopping cart. So /H1 shopping cart. Okay. So next things. I want to be able to kind of have these different things that are in my cart be a little bit different. And so the way we typically do that is we use something called a property. A property allows you to pass data from a parent component down to a child component. So you say, here I've got some data up here, I want to pass it down. So I want to add, the way that I want this to look is I would say, hey, I want the name to be here, and I might say this is a hat. I've got a quantity of some sort, so the quantity is 2. Now I have to pass that right now as a string. Quantity of 2. And I also want another item in here. And from my screen mock-up, that was tie it 2, belt it 1. So tie quantity 2, belt quantity 1. So I'm going to basically define the data up here and pass it down. So I want to add these kind of custom attributes, these custom properties on my custom component, and we're going to pass that data through. Is everybody good with this? This kind of makes sense, what we're doing here? Okay. So there won't have been anything that changed yet. If you look in the browser, nothing's changed because I haven't changed my component to read either of those properties. It's not doing anything with the name. It's not doing anything with the quantity. So I need to go into my cart item class. Okay. The way you receive properties is you just add a little parameter, call it props. Okay. So these are the properties that are being set on your item. Okay. I can now read those pretty easily. So I'm going to go back in here. Rather than hard coding the property, I'm going to say props.name. And here I'm going to say props.quantity. So the two things that we defined up top should be here, and that should get you something that looks more like this, right? So I can pass data down pretty easily. Another trick we commonly do, because we oftentimes don't want to write props a bunch of times, another trick we often do is we actually might destructure the properties. So a common thing that you'll see is a lot of people will do this, is they'll say name, comma, quantity, and that puts it directly into variables name and quantity. Rather than having to say props.name and props.quantity, you just refer to name and quantity.
Does it have to be props?
I don't think it has to be, but if you do name it, please name it props. If you do name it, please keep it with it. It's kind of the standard with, that's a well-established standard with React, is that it's always called props. So that can make things a little bit slicker if you destructure the properties a little bit, and most people do. Cool. Okay, so we've got a good start. What I'm actually going to do next is I'm going to play around a little bit with the CSS. Okay, so I'm going to make it look a little bit nicer than what it looks like right now. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I actually kind of want to bring in Bootstrap. Right? We've looked at Bootstrap before. I want to see if I can add Bootstrap to this project. Okay, so it's a little bit different than what we've done before, though. Okay, the way we bring in Bootstrap is we're not going to pull it down from, say, the CDN. We're not going to download the files. We're actually going to install them as a dependency. So I'm going to do npm install Bootstrap. I'm just going to install it as a regular dependency from npm. Okay. If you look at the package.json, you're going to see I now have a dependency on Bootstrap 5.143. Okay. So we can bring in additional dependencies from Bootstrap. Okay. The next thing I need to do is add a link. I need to bring in the CSS style sheet for Bootstrap. Okay. If I look at the official documentation, I'm actually going to go out to the Bootstrap page, and we're going to take a look at this. So if I go to Get Bootstrap, I believe they actually kind of specify how to do this in their directions. So go into Docs, go to Download. Notice that they say npm install. Notice here, say something about import Bootstrap from Bootstrap. And so there should be a place here where it mentions something about the Sass. I forget which page.
It said Sass.
Yeah. Does it say? Bootstrap's package.json consists of metadata and all keys, Sass, and style. So effectively what I want to bring in is the already bundled version of Bootstrap. You can use it directly via Sass, and I don't want to go that far today. I just want to use the bundled CSS file. Okay. So I think, let me see if we can get to it. Maybe it's on the npm package itself. Here we go. Documentation. Okay, so it doesn't say on the npm package how to do it either. Okay, so I'm going to guess. I'm going to try and recall it from memory what I need to do here. So up here in the index.js file, okay, you'll notice we already have an index.css. So right before the index.css, I'm going to import. Okay, and that should be kind of a hint, right? So remember, // is something that belongs to our project, but here we're bringing something in from Bootstrap, so it's going to be Bootstrap / yeah, here's where I want to be. So distributable, dist, that's the bundled version of the Bootstrap file. So I'm going to go into dist, and then I'm going to go into CSS, and then does my IntelliSense give me? No, it doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to have to actually look into node modules and figure out the file. So if I look into node modules, there's Bootstrap somewhere in here. Yeah, there's a lot of dependencies right now. So I'm going to go into dist, CSS, there we go. So the file I want is, there should be, yeah, I think this is the one I want, bootstrap.min.css. So I'm going to bring in bootstrap dist CSS, bootstrap.min.css. Okay, and so that should bring in the entire Bootstrap style sheet, which we would normally include in the head. It won't bring anything in, it won't bring any of the JavaScript in for Bootstrap, but I'm okay with that. I really just want the CSS. I just want their style sheet. I don't want all the other things. Okay. Oh, I need to restart my server because I killed my server. So when I installed it, I stopped it. So npm start it back up. Okay, so it should already look a little bit different, right? So you can see there's kind of a sans serif font on the top. That's a good indication that I have Bootstrap up and installed. Okay, so now that we've got Bootstrap installed, again, really install Bootstrap, that one line. We're going to go into the card item, and I'm going to start adding some Bootstrap classes. So remember when we were talking about the HTML and stuff, we said, hey, the class I need to set here is form control. Okay. On the quantity, I might want to give that a class maybe of M3 to give it some margin. On the button, I'm going to say maybe some margin and the button class as well. So class name, btn primary, and M3. Just going to put some margin around it. I'm going to kind of do the same thing with the remove button, but this will be btn danger. So that should make the remove button red and the first button blue. Okay. So I'm starting to see where I'm trying to get, right? Not perfect yet, but it's moving towards that direction. Okay. The reason things broke up into different parts is because form control actually turns the inline, the input into a block. But I'm going to fix that by making the whole thing, the whole div, just a flexbox container. And so that'll push it all back onto one line. So I'm going to add the class dflex up here. Dflex, which is going to say display flex. So I've got a flex container. That's a lot better. Okay, so it's all kind of laying out in one line. I might maybe want to play around with that and get my inputs to be shorter. I'm not going to worry about that yet. But we're starting to see some of those fields. Okay. Now, I want to add some additional attributes in there because remember things like we kind of talked about, everything here should probably have an ID. Everything should probably have some name that's an input. So I need to set some of those things up. So here, I might want to say this has some sort of ID. So I might want to say this is the name or item name. Actually, I've got, this is in cart item. So let's say cart item name, following their convention. This would be cart item quantity. This would be cart item add, cart item remove. So I'm giving all those different IDs. Are these IDs unique within the page? Within the page? No, because you got multiple things that have the same ID, right? So that might be an issue. I think I actually I come to think of it, I think I may have actually wanted to set these up as classes. I mean, I probably want to have unique IDs, but this I think I really just want to do those as classes. So I'm going to move those over to the class name property instead. Come to think of it. And remove the IDs. Yeah, I think that's better. Okay. I may also want to add a custom class to the outer div. So that would be the cart item. Okay. So that gives me a way, if I wanted to target some custom CSS, I can target it to all the different parts of the cart item, one by one. I do need to remember to set these buttons. I need to set their type to button, because otherwise by default they will be submit buttons, and I don't really want them to be submitting any sort of form. I just want to handle what they do manually. Okay. All right. So maybe the next thing I want to do is turn those buttons, change those buttons so that they look like plus and minus. Okay. So going back here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of push this down like so. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this text here, span, /span. I'm going to put it in a span. And I'm going to give that span the class of visually hidden. Okay. That's going to make the text itself go away. Okay. As you can see, there's no text on it, right? The text is still there kind of in the HTML, so screen readers can still see it. But it's not actually visible to the user. And I want to do the same thing with the remove button. So both the add and the remove button are not going to have any text. Okay. I think I want to add those in just as plus and minus. I do need to kind of check the Bootstrap documentation on that. So bootstrap.com. Oh, get Bootstrap. I don't know. That was a fat finger. I think that was goosetrap.com anyway. I'm going to go to, it's under utilities, visibility. Oh, no, it's not there. It's not there. It's under, let me look here. Search bar. So visually visually hidden. Because there should be a visually visible too. Visually hidden. Visually... Okay, they don't have an inverted version of that. It doesn't look like. Okay. So the plus and minus will just have to always be there. Then, at least in this rendering. What I'd kind of like to do is put in, I'd like to add in Font Awesome, but there's a few gotchas to try and get Font Awesome working with React, and it's been a while since I did that. So I don't want to do that on the fly. So, React. Okay, there we go. So we got plus and minus. We can also use, I think there's a rounded class. Maybe if I use rounded and maybe a little bit less margin, M1. Rounded, M1. Or was it circular? Utilities. It's under borders. Border radius. Ah, there we go. Border rounded circle. That's the one I'm thinking of. So rounded circle, not just rounded. So rounded circle, M1, rounded circle, M1. There we go. They're not really square, unfortunately, but it's a start. Okay. So, I mean, you're seeing a start, you can kind of play around with it, add some Bootstrap classes, get it kind of looking a lot nicer than it looks like out of the box. Okay. So let's go back and kind of think about what's the next part that we need to do. So I've got 3 items appearing here, right? I don't have any functionality built up, right? I can kind of pre-populate it with those 3 items. None of my buttons are working. So let's try to work with these 2 buttons. So I'm going to work with the plus and the minus buttons to try and get them working. Okay. So in React, I'm going to go to the button. I'm going to add an attribute on click. So I say on click, we want to do something. Okay, so remember the curly brace says, hey, I'm jumping back into JavaScript. Okay, and what I need to do is define a Lambda function to say what to do. So it's going to be event arrow. You might notice this is, in some sense, it's kind of similar to the add event listener, but it's kind of hard-coded into the onClick property itself. And then I need to tell it what to do. Okay, so this is the event object. I can then tell it what to do on the right-hand side. Okay, usually what we find is that it gets kind of cumbersome if you try to put all the logic right here. So I usually break the logic over for that right side off into a separate function that I can define up here. So I might say function on add. That takes an event, right? So up here I can decide what to do when you click the add button. So I'm going to call on add, and down here I'm going to say on add EVT. So I hook up like this, EVT on add, and that calls it up there. Cool. Things you'll notice here, notice I'm defining a function inside of another function. That's entirely intentional. So this is kind of called composition. I'm composing multiple functions together. Okay. So in this function, I can do things like, well, maybe we want to modify the quantity. Okay. Now watch what happens if I just change the quantity. Quantity plus equals 1. Okay. I'm going to go back. Watch my screen a second here. Nothing seems to happen. Okay. If I go to the console and refresh this and try it again, there's, by the way, a warning because I set something up wrong earlier. But you'll notice either way, if I try to if I try to hit plus, nothing seems to happen. I can do a console log just to verify that the method's being called. Console.log. And I can say, let's log add. And you can see there's definitely a log message appearing every time, but nothing's changing. Okay? So one of the things to know about React is anytime you want to kind of have the front end change, typically we need to cause the front end to re-render itself, right? We need to re-render the tree. Okay? This doesn't cause the tree to be re-rendered. I'm just changing a local variable, right? The tree never gets re-rendered. Okay? So I need to do something that's going to cause the tree to be rendered. Everybody good with that? Okay, I need to do something that's going to cause the tree to be re-rendered.
Talking about the React DOM tree, right?
Yep, the shadow DOM. Yeah, the shadow DOM. So this local variable doesn't do that. What I need to introduce to this element is I need to introduce a concept called state. Okay, so state tracks what's the current value, and the way that this works out, if I change the state, it will cause a re-render. Okay, so rather than changing the variable locally, I'm going to cause a change to the state. So we're going to add what's called a hook. Okay, I need to actually import that first. So going up to the top, import use state from React. I can't remember if it's React DOM or just React, but I think it might be that one. Let me double check here. I think I had the page open somewhere. Here. So docs, hooks, introduction to hooks. Yes, it's from React. It's from React, not React DOM. Okay. So I say use state, and in here we're going to say I want to add some additional state. So we say const. We're going to do some destructuring. We're going to say that's use state. So use state basically adds a state variable to this component. Okay. When I call use state, I have to say what's the initial value of that state. Okay. So what's the initial value of that state? Probably this quantity variable here, right? Okay. So that's the initial state. Okay. Which gets kind of interesting because that's now not the quantity, that's the initial quantity. Is everybody tracking with me there? Okay. So I may have to use some different naming. So the quantity comes in here. I'm going to say this is the current quantity, and then comma set quantity. So this creates a state variable. We're going to initialize it to the quantity property. And then we're going to come back and destructure. It gives us the current value of that state and a setter for that state. Okay, so everybody see that? Current value of the state and setter for that state. Okay. So rather than setting these things, I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say, rather than setting the quantity variable, I'm going to call set quantity, and this is going to be current quantity plus 1. I also need to make sure when I render it, that I render it as current quantity. So I got current quantity down here. We call set quantity when you click the button. If we try that out, something's not right. What did I break? Set quantity is not a function. Set quantity is not. Where are you looking at? Line 8?
Line 9 for your point. Should we make it use state staff?
No, it's this one here. So what did it tell me in the stack trace? It said set quantity is not a function, but set quantity is a function. Let me try calling it set current quantity. Set current quantity. Oop. So why does it not like it? Oh, it might be because I declared this with the function syntax. I think I might need to declare this with an I think I might need to declare that with an arrow syntax. Let me just check that real quick. So on add, I'm going to turn that into an arrow function and refresh. Same. Set current quantity is not a function. Oh, bah, I see why it is. Let me backtrack. Okay. When I destructure over here, I use curly braces. I needed to use square brackets. That's what I did wrong. Because useState returns an array with 2 elements, not an object with 2 elements. That's why. So I'm going to go back to set quantity as the name. There we go. It's doing something.
And we know how to fix that something.
Yeah, that's called string concatenation.
Yeah, it's called string concatenation. Yeah, so I'm taking current quantity, adding 1. This is because current quantity is already a string. So I need to start with, at the beginning, parsing the quantity when I initialize the state. Okay. And then it should be a number from there on out. Okay. So this component now kind of has some state. I can do a similar thing. I could maybe make an Onremove function, and I can say let's Onremove. We're going to remove 1. And I'm going to hook that up to the other button the same way. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to enter on click EVT arrow on remove EVT, and that should get us both of the buttons adding and removing. That goes up, that goes down. Questions so far?
Mine's not doing it.
Okay. Make sure that you've changed this to current quantity instead of quantity. Because remember, quantity refers to the property quantity, which never changes, but the current quantity does. The current quantity changes, the quantity does not change. Oh, current quantity. Just current quantity. Like it's a little different. Yes. Yeah.
Number goes up.
That was intended to be.
Number goes up, number goes down. Success.
We never stop healing. We always have more.
4 hours of lecture, number goes up, number goes down. But it's awesome.
Oh my God.
So we're playing around. I mean, this part's kind of hands-on. And you're getting kind of play around.
Can you explain this to me? Ready for this? Great.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, we gotta fix that.
Okay, so let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Oh, you can't change the name right now. Because I did something. Okay. And we haven't fixed it. Okay. Can I?
So this is
We're 425. Now, go ahead and push up. If you've got this working, go ahead and push it up and we'll continue this tomorrow.
so we made this new state and we're paying attention to the quantity. We got current quantity from the circle. Oh, so set quantity changes current.
You can actually call that function anything you want. You can call it set current quantity and you set quantity.
So inside of our function, we call this function set quantity. And is variable by one. So this is that only solving. Set quantity.
So as that. Oh, you didn't specify the property. So in this name, in this house. The quantity. That's right. There you said it. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So at least it's doing something. So you want to say.
Where is the,
On the
what's the thing?
This building.
This building? So you can new class?
Yeah, I'm gonna see a signing classroom.
Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, so that's you would stay in your
Okay.
classroom classes. I know about it.
The maximum start.
We'll be removing the monitors though.
Oh, you will? Oh, I see.
We don't want anything to walk.
Yeah, the walking is.
So obviously we're very comfortable on
Awesome. Starting. Oh, great. That's perfect.
Do you have to have a key to get into that classroom? If you just walk into the floor.
Well, if there's class and it's open,
It's up in the, not class, it's locked. Might be interrupted, they will unlock it and interrupt.
Yeah, and this is the everybody else.
see ya.
Also, I know you said bring your own equipment on here, and you mentioned TVs. Does that mean monitors too?
Yeah.
I think that's also wrong.
Is the hook line 5? Is line 5 where the
That's the whole hook.
is it the hook?
That's the hook. Line 5 is the hook. So you just say use state, you bring in use state at the top, or you say import. Say import, use state.
Yeah.
Use state, you say what's the initial value of the state? So right now it's coming from the property.
Yeah.
And then I destructure it, so I get the current value of that state and a setter for that state. And the setter will probably render. Okay. Now I'm gonna have to move this around.
But you essentially rename quantities.
Sort of. Quantity is not changing in current quantity is. They're actually two different variables. You have property versus the state. What I need to do tomorrow is I need to actually get the state out of here and move it up a layer. And then we need to actually voice that state. So right now the state's here. I'm gonna have to move it back up to the out component. Okay. So that's going to get rid of the weirdness. There'll just be a quantity here when I'm done.
Yeah.
So current quantity is kind of temporary.
Well, this is good. If you're recording it, this
Yeah.
could be very useful.
Yep.